Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that uncovers what you don't know about your food, the people who produce it, and today, the stories behind the machinery that sustains it. I am your host, Dana DePrima. Let's sidewind our way into the heart of farm innovation, resilience, and the unexpected tales that have shaped agriculture. Today's guest is Lee Klancher, a writer and photographer with an enduring fascination for the world of tractors and farm machinery. Lee's path from being a gearhead kid on a small dairy farm in Wisconsin to becoming an acclaimed author with a book selling tens of thousands of copies is as compelling as the machines he documents. What's more, we'll hear about some of the most pivotal moments in tractor history, from a farmer turned engineer who built a 200 horsepower giant out of necessity to the cutthroat world of R&D espionage that echoes corporate rivalries like Coke versus Pepsi, but with a rural mechanical twist. If you've ever wondered how tractors evolved from utilitarian finger-chopping behemoths into sleek, powerful marvels that fuel modern agriculture, or how innovations can be buried by major players for strategic reasons, well, you're in the right place.
I was a gearhead as a kid. I grew up on a farm, but I was into motorcycles and cars. That was my thing. Anything with a motor, I was into, especially motorcycles. But when I went to college, I was going to be an engineer, and I always wanted to be a writer. I changed my mind, and I studied science writing in college. And I worked for the school magazine and won some awards, got some attention. A local book publisher reached out to me and said, hey, we're creating these books about tractors, and we'd like somebody with a science and engineering background to write about them. And I wrote a book in 1994 or 5, and it sold 40,000 copies. I was like, okay, tractors. And what I discovered was I love the fact that the tractor is a machine that had so much significance to our world. I mean, I always liked the history of motorcycles, but motorcycles are just transportation. Tractors feed us. And I love to say that the internet exists because of tractors. It's a bit of a stretch, but what I'm saying is if you go back far enough, if you don't go back far, 80, 90% of us were subsistence farmers, right? And if you're doing that, that's a hard lifestyle. You do not have time to piddle around in your garage and invent a computer. So until farming gets automated, there's no way we as a society are going to make that leap.
Tractors have been more than just a tool. They've transformed society. Before mechanized farming, approximately 80 to 90% of the population worked in agriculture just to produce enough food to survive. The advent of tractors in the early 20th century changed that drastically, allowing for higher productivity and freeing up labor for other industries. This shift laid the groundwork for advancements in technology and industrialization, indirectly contributing to innovations like computers and other complex machinery.
That's a fun way to illustrate that point of how important farm technology is to us as a society. So I love that. And at that time, I was doing a lot of outdoor and nature photography, which I still love. I love the outdoors, and that's something I really enjoy. Well, photographing tractors is really nature photography because their environment is the farm and its fields and pastures. And sometimes I use old sheds and all kinds of things I really enjoy. So I really came to love the photography. I came to love the role the tractor had and the history. There's very few of us digging into it deeply. So it was also very quickly something that I could be on the bleeding edge, which I liked. So there's just a lot of things that kind of rolled up that made it become something I've written a lot about and really enjoy. I know the history, I know who made them, I know why things are the way they are, I understand the engineering.
Tell me about some of the other big historical milestones or tent poles for tractors.
I would say, so styling was a big thing. Tractors used to be gray and ugly, and now they're colorful and have sculpted fenders. So one of the really neat transition times in tractors is the 1930s, when industrial designers were making waves of everything, right? Coke bottles, cigarette packages, trains were big, right? The streamliners. And there's all these very high profile, really artists like Henry Dreyfuss and Ray Lowy and others who were restyling American products. Ray Lowy, the fridge. When Sears had a cold spot fridge, and when Ray Lowy redid it, sales went up 10 times. They sold millions and millions. So all of a sudden, we as a society are realizing if things are attractive, and those people would also make them useful. It was really interesting intersection of art and utility. So the world's figuring that out. The tractor companies figured that out. And all of a sudden, tractors go from these things built and designed by engineers that had gears and levers and exposed things and just, looked like it could chop your finger off, which, as anyone on a farm knows, that's not so hard to do. These old ones were sort of designed to chop fingers off. And then to these sleek, beautiful machines. So that's a really interesting period that starts in the 30s. And that was a continued to evolve into the 60s. So that's a neat inflection point. The 60s were all about horsepower. Some guys, a really cool thing that happened in the 1950s was the big makers, Deere and IH, and others at that time, Alice Chalmers, there was a half dozen that were in the mix. Deere and IH were the big ones, but there were some other ones that were significant. We're focused on sort of what you'd think of as a traditional tractor, right? A small with the big wheels in the back, maybe a 40, 50 horsepower tractor that everybody had on their farm, Farmall M or H or whatever you might be familiar with. That's what they were focused on, because that's, especially post-war, you could sell a lot of those. The farmer was already feeling the squeeze that's going on today, which is labor, right? And productivity. You got to produce more to be efficient and to survive as a farmer. 40 acres wasn't enough, then 100 acres wasn't enough, and then 1,000 acres wasn't enough. And everybody's leaving, so you don't have help. So that's a theme that just hasn't stopped. And at that time, farmers realized they needed bigger tractors. So a company named Wagner out on the West Coast built one. And a fella in northern Minnesota named Douglas Steiger and his brother Maurice and his father John noticed the Wagners. And they're like, look, at the time, it was hard times in Minnesota. And they'd had a lot of rain and it might have been drought, but they weren't harvesting very well. And they ran a side business contracting out with heavy equipment. So they could make good money driving their dozers and et cetera. But if all three of them had to go harvest in the fields, it didn't work. So they figured out if they had one of these big Wagners, dad could go and harvest, and the two boys could go off and drive the heavy equipment and make money, and they could survive. So Doug, the son, goes to the bank. Doug also is very handy. Doug goes to the banker and he says, look, I can buy this Wagner, but I need to borrow 24 grand. But if you give me 10,000, I think I can build my own. The banker gives him the 10 grand. He goes home, builds this machine. He buys used heavy equipment, construction parts, engine, driveline, hand builds the controls and everything. And it works great. It's a 200 horsepower tractor. It still exists. It's in Fargo, North Dakota. Well, his neighbors start saying, hey, can you build me one of those? That grows to become a worldwide brand. One of the greatest stories in agriculture, greatest stories in business. They built them out of the barn from 1957 until roughly 1970 and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And about every 2 to 5 years, some calamity happened that should have taken them out, and some miracle happened and they continued. So, and that continued into the 70s. Just amazing story. And that brand lives today. Case IH bought them eventually in the 80s, but they're still, the Steiger name is still on the side of tractors, and Douglas Steiger is still alive and telling stories about it. But talk about just a wonderful, you have a problem, solve it with a welder. That's what Doug did.
In this history of tractors, there's this interesting story of lying and deceit and drama, and you pinched upon it.
I did. It's always one of the fun parts of ag industry, and I suppose any industry, but I feel like this one, particularly, they're so close, like in Moline, Illinois, there's multiple plants and multiple headquarters, and they all test in similar places. And so these engineers are always snooping around trying to figure out what's going on. And, if you can spot somebody, you can figure out a technology they have, if you can figure out a weakness the machine has, then you can exploit it.
The rivalry between John Deere and International Harvester, or IH, is legendary in agricultural circles. These two giants competed fiercely, not just in sales, but in engineering and innovation. This competition often involved dramatic measures such as hiring spies to sneak around test sites and engineers taking clandestine photos of prototypes. These actions weren't just for show. They influenced the pace and direction of technological advancements in the industry, setting the stage for some of the most significant machinery developments of the 20th century.
One of the great stories that happens later is a guy crawled under a John Deere that was a prototype, and he took his knife for whatever reason and scraped the oil pan, and it was aluminum. And he's like, well, this thing's not going to be good. So he went back, they figured it out. Next thing you know, when the thing comes out, they got an ad campaign that said, hey, if you want to buy this, fine, but it's aluminum, it's not well made. So there's all kinds of stories like that of people sneaking around and finding things. So I went back and I focused on that. And then I had a number of people, one in particular, former retired chief combine engineer for Case IH, Don Watt, went through step by step how they did it and what they would do and how they'd get this information. And it's just really fun. And they'd take pictures of each other. They would fly airplanes over, small planes over the testing grounds, hoping to catch things. Both companies, Deere and Harvester, had rooms with Deere famously had a butcher shop in Iowa where the new generation tractor, a very big deal. And when they went away from 2 cylinders and made a 4-cylinder, they took a small group of engineers, bought a little butcher shop, covered all the windows with black, and stuffed them in there to go build it in complete secrecy because they absolutely needed nobody to know that was coming. Harvester with the axial flow combine, very similar. They had a room that for a while only 6 people could even go in, were even allowed in the building.
R&D, Coke and Pepsi, all these little secrets.
Exactly.
I'm curious if anything ever happened. I mean, you said there were some calamities with the Steigers, but that nothing ever happened with them and Wagner having copied the machine?
Oh, he didn't copy it. It was his own design. You do bring up the whole patent issue. So as long as your design is unique enough, you're fine, right? But there's things you can't get around. So Wagner and Steiger had no issues. Wagner, for one thing, didn't last all that long. Deere bought him out in the 70s, I believe it was, and ended up actually ending the company because Wagner was about to go bankrupt. They signed a contract they shouldn't have. And if Deere stopped doing it, they were essentially dead. So there wasn't issues there, but there will often be designs that are too close. So you can study what they do and you can go and do it your own way if that's possible. A famous one that's in the book. So John Deere had a corn head, a thing to pick corn that was really good. Well, Deere, IH came out with one and Deere's like, wait, no, this is too close. And so they sued him. And then in the court case, it came out that the IH engineer, John Deere, had film of him going to their experience center and going around it with a tape measure, taking pictures. He went and checked it right there, and of course they had security cameras. And so they're like, they lost that lawsuit. So you have to find ways as an engineer to duplicate what's been done without ripping off the actual design. That's a fine line. That's a tricky thing.
And I'm just curious about that kind of push and pull where who's driving the equation here? Is it the engineering and the tractor companies, or is it the farmers saying like, well, we got to do it this way?
Or is it engineers saying, like, here's a better way to be able to harvest this without damaging the plant?
It's a super dynamic situation. So if you go back all the way to the beginning, it was just engineers figuring out something that might work. And then you get into, I'd say, the 50s, and I'm going over things quickly, but by the 50s, the tractor companies were driven by making it look good. But so industrial designers were driving things, but you've got this long process to get there. So you might have these designers who draw something beautiful, right? Well, you're going to have to retool that entire platform to look that way. They only do that every, 5 to 30 years. So that gets influenced by manufacturing costs, decisions like that. And then in the 50s, they really started surveying farmers and listening to farmers more. That process continues today. So many of these engineers and so many of the people at the ag companies still today are farm kids. So I really think we were talking about how farmers are, right? How they solve problems. It just leads them to becoming ag engineers. It's just kind of it's like you're already as a 14-year-old in the field solving problems and learning how to do things. So a lot of them are farm kids, but they have learned more and more to listen to surveys and listen to farmers. The other part of it is the tooling and the change is just so expensive. Tractors are very big things. They're sold in small numbers compared to, say, sewing machines. So they'll plan for a decade to update these platforms. And the other thing about that that's really neat is the big companies get focused on the big problems. So their machines will, let's say now, that same trend is going. We need more horsepower, we need more capability. They'll be doing that. But if there's a smaller niche that needs to be filled, it'll be by independent developers. And that's what happened with the Steiger story. The tractor companies were focused on 60 horsepower two-wheel drive tractors, and they were totally missing this 200 horsepower four-wheel drive. So it was built at home.
Today, the tractor industry is not just about horsepower and mechanical reliability. It has evolved to include sophisticated technologies such as precision farming, GPS-guided tractors, and even autonomous machinery. These innovations allow farmers to plant, monitor, and harvest with unparalleled accuracy, maximizing yields while conserving resources. However, while technology promises great efficiency, it also comes with the risk of obsolescence for smaller operators unable to afford these advancements.
And that's happening yet today, that any really exciting, niche-y little cutting-edge innovation is often done by an independent. And there's just a tremendous amount of farm innovation coming out of the middle of the country.
And so what would some of those companies be? They're just independent operators, or they're smaller companies?
Well, it varies. There's always your kind of independent genius. And there was a combine called the bi-rotor combine, which is this new technology that I believe was purchased by Deere and buried. But this was a one-man show out of, and I forget his name right now. There's a great book about it. And he was out of Kansas, I believe it was, and he developed it pretty much as his baby. He did build a company. There's other companies like Raven, that do a lot of really high-tech automation things with implements. And they were a startup and became a pretty big company and then got bought out. But it ranges. Sometimes it's one person with a vision, as it has been, going way back in history. And they might develop this new technology and do their best to put it out there.
And when you say a company like John Deere would buy another company and bury it, what are you talking about?
So the way most combines work is a single rotor. The bi-rotor uses two. It's a really difficult technology to make work. This guy made it work. He was trying to sell it for years. Sometimes companies, notably big companies like Deere is very careful about their R&D expenses, will buy a tech like that to keep it out of the competition's hands and to own it. So if at some point, they probably bought it did the numbers, and if they develop this and produce it, they're going to make less than they're making on their existing line. So they just stick it in a closet somewhere. And at some point down the road, maybe they'll do it, but they own it, so nobody else is going to do it. And that's not uncommon. Deere, particularly in the time period of this book, was developing a tremendous amount of new technology, and most of it didn't make sense to produce. So they stuck it back on a shelf.
Because there are only so many customers, really, for the big stuff like that.
Well, and anytime you develop something for production, it's massively expensive. So if you have something existing and it works pretty well and this other thing's better, but it's going to cost you billions to get it into production, it just doesn't make sense.
All of this history and all of Lee's experience digging around in tractor sheds and with these compelling machines leads him to write a new book, a dramatic nonfiction retelling of a competitive battle between two tractor companies, John Deere and International Harvester. It includes some pretty fun tractor shenanigans and is for you if you're interested in the history of agriculture, as it covers the agriculture tech race during the worst farm crisis in modern history.
Okay, in the story and the spy,
Yeah.
who's Snoopy?
Snoopy is the 2+2 tractor. So the tractor on the cover. And actually that nickname was given supposedly by Deere because it was a funny looking tractor. It had a big long nose, so they called it the anteater. They called it Snoopy. This was not a complimentary term. But that tractor was really interesting at this time because IH was kind of struggling. They came up with a way to develop this pretty economically. It gave them a real weapon in that market. It was fairly unique in a number of the things it did. And the central character, Bud Ewell, who was a salesperson for IH, sales executive, and very, very colorful one, took on Snoopy as his personal mission and helped make it sell, make it successful. And ultimately, the book centers around Bud sneaking into the Superdome to sneak into a private John Deere event. That's where it opens and that's where it ends. And he's doing that to learn about this machine Deere is introducing that he fears might compete with Snoopy. So the spy is Bud Ewell and Snoopy is the 2+2 tractor.
Okay, so Snoopy and the spy happen to be on the same side.
They do. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it's a bit of an IH centric story, but there is a lot about Deere as well and others.
And is this the straw that broke the camel's back for IH?
The time period is. Snoopy was not, and Bud Ewell's antics in the Superdome didn't ultimately sink them. But this time period from 79 to 82 is where the company failed because of many of the problems they had came to head in this time. I wouldn't want to put everything on why they failed in that time. It started in the 50s, but this is the time it all comes together and things go sideways.
Do you have a favorite tractor in all of the history of tractors?
Probably the most intrigue around it would be the Magnum. So I would say the Magnum is the one just because it's so pivotal. But for me, it would all be about the quality of the story about it.
Why? Tell me why it's pivotal, the story of the Magnum.
So after International Harvester gets sold in the 80s, things don't get any better for the ag industry, right? That's 84 when they get sold. And things gradually improve for the farm, but it's really slow. And the merger was managed horribly, and it's a mess. J.I. Case management took over Harvester, and they were much smaller. They threw out all the Harvester management. They nearly threw the color away. It was just a disaster, and people were at each other's throats. Didn't go well. And you've got a farm economy that's, horrible. So the company very easily could have failed at that time and just entirely they go away. The Magnum tractor they create in this era, and many of the people who are there say, the machine was so good, it saved the company. And it also was sort of a start of healing the divisions between these two companies that have been kind of shoved ungratefully together, and helped them to go forward and create a company now.
You could call it an ongoing crisis in farming. So many farmers, especially the newer farmers and the small farmers, have been going out of business by the hundreds of thousands, and we're losing more than 20 million acres in 5 years of farmland. What's the intersection there for that and the world of tractors?
Well, as you know, it's a cyclical business, and there's always those ups and downs, but 82 was the lowest point in modern history since 1933. So that isn't where this starts. This starts in the late 70s, which actually I think people forget were very good. 79 was fantastic. But sort of with the grain embargo in January of 80, things start trending downward, and it just gets so tough. This time was pretty dark. Farms were going away. They weren't profitable. And it was harder to be profitable, and it just squeezed out the average family farmer. So in the book, one of the things I did was all the imagery is from the period, including there's probably 20 or 30 images that a number of documented photographers took of farmers at the time, and they're just tremendously powerful. There's a guy at a meeting. In fact, one of them is a man who's at a meeting, and they're having a very animated conversation, which you can sort of imagine. Well, one of our readers recognized the picture, knew it was his dad, and called and says, my dad went to that meeting because he didn't know what to do. He couldn't afford to buy enough to feed his cattle. So he went to the meeting, and at the meeting where he's sitting there, they helped him and pointed him to farm aid, and he was able to get enough aid and survive. So, that time period really is key to this. One of the things that I really came to really appreciate that as I was writing, and sometimes you learn as you write, was that Bud Ewell, who's our lead character and salesperson and was a Marine, he had to know. Everybody had to know. If you go back and put yourself in the day-to-day in the newspapers and stuff, you knew the company's going to fail, right? He's still going 150%. In fact, when he goes into that Superdome, I think he may have done it just to give his coworkers a boost and say, I'm going to, just to do something crazy, get people something to think about besides this ongoing doom. And I feel like there's a really universal takeaway there. We're all going to face hard times. That's life, right? And you're going to have some times where you really are tested. And these times were tremendous tests. And it's pretty inspirational. Bud didn't lay down. Bud didn't quit. Bud didn't go work for somebody else. Bud didn't even shut his mouth. He just kept charging up that hill. And that out of this book, I think, was just the most powerful thing I took away from it, learning as I wrote it.
I think people are like that even today. I work with a lot of farmers who are continuing to charge up the hill or have a really bad stretch and are like, nope, I'm not giving up. It is inspirational. It's very human spirit. I think we attach it to the American spirit. We've had so many farmers, victims of these disasters, and I haven't talked to one who's throwing in the towel. I'm sure there are a few that have no choice, but there's been a lot of devastation, and I think people are stepping up to help where they can.
Farming is such a risk every time. I remember I was taking pictures at a guy's place in Oklahoma, and we were standing at a hill and looking over his cornfields. And he told me how much he spent on seed. And he's like, yep, and I don't remember the number. It was big. I want to say $500,000. And he's like, I don't know what that's going to be. That might be enough to feed my family for the next couple of years. It might be if he turns his in insurance, he doesn't make any money. He loses money. And every year you're doing that. It takes a certain kind of courage. So I think a farmer already has that to get through their ordinary day. And then when these natural disasters or economic crashes happen, it's even tougher. So definitely lessons for all of us, I think.
Tell me now when your book is coming out. It's this month, and how people get a hold of it.
It will be on the shelves the first week of November. You can buy our books anywhere books are sold. OctavePress.com is great. Of course, you can buy direct from us, and then we'll put you on our email newsletter and send you updates and all that. But you can get the books anywhere. A lot of the Case IH dealerships will carry them too, so you can check there. But your local bookstore, any online seller, all those places will have it.
I hope today's episode has shed light not only on the mechanical ingenuity and historical milestones of tractors, but also on the indomitable spirit behind those innovations. Lee Klancher's stories remind us that the agricultural world is filled with problem solvers, risk takers, and those who, in the face of uncertainty, refuse to quit. Just like Bud Ewell's relentless push during challenging times, or the pioneering inventors building from barns and workshops, the spirit of farming innovation is an enduring testament to resilience. If Lee's stories intrigue you, remember, check out his latest work, now available wherever books are sold, including octanepress.com. And as we reflect on today's journey, let's not forget the farmers who continue to adapt and innovate, standing as beacons of courage and determination. Thank you for tuning in to One Bite is Everything. Until next time, I am Dana DePrima, your host. Let's keep exploring the stories behind every bite.